Good evening, and thank you for joining us at another Northshire Presents virtual event. I'm Rachel Person, Director of Events for Northshire Bookstore, which has store locations in Manchester Center, Vermont, and Saratoga Springs, New York. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Before we get started, a few very quick notes. First of all, thank you so much for your support of independent bookstores and independent bookselling. We couldn't do this without people like you, so thank you very much. A logistical note, please use the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen for any questions that you have this evening. You can pose your questions at any time. We'll save them up and I'll pose them for you at the end of the evening. If you can't find the Q&A box, you can also put questions into the chat. I am so pleased to be the one to introduce Roxy Manning and Oren J. Sofer to you this evening. Roxy Manning has joined us to discuss her book, How to Have Anti-Racist Conversations. She is a clinical psychologist and certified trainer and assessor for the Center for Nonviolent Communication. She regularly leads workshops centered on nonviolent communication and social change in the United States and internationally. Since 2004, she has operated a private consulting business supporting organizations and corporations to address power differences and foster inclusion. As a psychologist, she works primarily with the homeless population of San Francisco. Oren J. Sofer has joined us to discuss his new book, Your Heart Was Made for This. He teaches Buddhist meditation, mindfulness, and communication internationally. He holds a degree in comparative religion from Columbia University and is a certified trainer of nonviolent communication and a somatic experiencing practitioner for the healing of trauma. His previous books include the best-selling title, Say What You Mean, A Mindful Approach to Nonviolent Communication. His teachings have reached people around the world through his online communication courses and guided meditations. Please join me in welcoming them to our screens this evening.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you to you and Northshire Books for organizing this event and inviting Roxy and I and gathering us all together. Before we start, I think Roxy and I each just wanted to say hello. I'm so happy to be here with each of you, even though I can't see your faces, I can see your names. And I'm also just delighted to be here with my dear friend and colleague, Roxy. We've known each other for quite a few years and teach nonviolent communication together here in the Bay Area and online. And so just happy to be here.
Thank you. And I'm also loving hearing Rachel talk about independent bookstores because there's something about being able to get access to make sure that people have a place to get information, to learn concepts that they would not learn in mainstream places, and then to be able to talk about it with my dear friend and with people who are interested to answer your questions is always really inspiring for me. So I'm looking forward to this evening.
Great. So we thought we would start. I'll read a little passage from my book, and then Roxy and I might talk a little bit about that, and then vice versa, have some conversation, and then towards the end, we'll open it up to hear questions from you. So I think I might actually start before reading a little bit. I just want to say a couple of words about what moved me to write this particular book, Your Heart Was Made for This. And I think there were two key impulses. One was during 2020, when the pandemic hit, and then we had this series of incredibly challenging upheavals, George Floyd's murder, the wildfires out here in the West, and everything that was adding up in the effects of the pandemic. As a meditation teacher, one contribution I could make was writing about how we build inner resources. And so that was really the start of the book. And then when my wife got pregnant, the book took on a different meaning for me, really looking ahead at the implications of climate change, how the impacts fall along the lines of racial injustice and income inequality, and really grappling inside with the question of how is our contemplative practice, or how is contemplative practice in general related to the need for social change, and what kind of support can it offer to those of us who are moved to respond to the urgent needs of our times. So this book is my own kind of exploration of that topic. So I'll read a little bit from the introduction. Your heart was made for love, for connection, belonging, and meaningful relationship with other people, beings, and the earth. Your heart was made to give and receive, to know joy, purpose, and freedom. All of this is possible for you and for each of us. Yet painful emotions, ignorance, and oppressive conditions disconnect us from our heart's potential. The Buddha long ago taught that we can shape our inner lives. Whatever the mind frequently thinks upon and ponders, that will become its inclination. Our thoughts, feelings, and intentions grow into habits and over time settle into our character. Contemplative practice roots itself in this power to mold the heart and thus renew ourselves. Today, we call this neuroplasticity. If we do not shape the heart, the world will do it for us. And the world does not have our highest welfare in mind. The tide of modern society floods us with incessant pressures, demands, and desires. On a personal level, urgency, confusion, and fear can spin us in a blur, grind us down, and sap our energy. On a global level, war, social unrest, and a growth-driven economy sweep through our communities, setting us on a course for violence and ecocide. It takes steady, continuous effort to swim against these currents, make choices based on our values, and turn the tide together. Responding effectively depends on training the heart and developing inner resources. We may not recognize it, but we're always practicing something. If you practice feeling anxious, stressed, agitated, you etch those grooves deeper. If you practice patience, kindness, and ease, with every moment, you grow stronger. In fact, these heart qualities can become your default orientation, so that when hardships arise, you draw not on old reactions, but on new strengths. This book guides you to discover and cultivate your best qualities. These qualities are complex, personal aspects of our humanity. Some, like attention and energy, you may recognize as universal. Others, like joy or devotion, may seem like things you either have or don't. But contemplative practice and modern neuroscience agree that each of these is an innate capacity that you can enhance just like any other skill. To meet our collective challenges and avert disaster, we must transform our hearts and also work at the level of society, applying these qualities globally. For personal and social transformation are inextricably linked. Focusing on internal transformation without also applying our love and wisdom to the world, we may fail to respond effectively to the suffering of others. Similarly, if we focus solely on external transformation without simultaneously healing our hearts, we risk recreating the ills we seek to address. How many revolutions have unwittingly replaced one domination system with another? Tragically, many efforts for social transformation are subverted by right-wrong thinking, us-them mentalities, and cancel culture. Without an internal practice complementing our external work, we can unconsciously reenact patriarchy, white supremacy, and other forms of oppression. So we strive for individual action and structural change to support each other. Service and social change work allow us to express our deep love and compassion for the world, while contemplative practice allows us to align means with ends, transforming internalized oppression and integrating our deepest values into social justice spaces. A truly nonviolent approach to social change sees no enemies, only fellow humans who might one day join us in beloved community. Cultivating the qualities shared in this book is one part of the journey to that community. I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you, Oren. Every time I hear that introductory passage, I feel inspired. And I think that's what I'd like to start asking you about because I feel so much hope in this little piece that you name, which is if we've been practicing some of these challenging behaviors, things that we've all learned growing up and living in this world, we are basically practicing behaviors that don't serve us. And your book talks about giving us the possibility to learn new behaviors and to have hope that we can actually change.
Yeah,
And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
absolutely. I'll share a little story. So one of the things that I do is I lead retreats and workshops just like you do. And many of those are in meditation. It's a silent container. It's a very intense experience for people. And one of the things I've been working on for years is what it's like for me in this body as a heterosexual man, as a white man, to be in a position of power and leadership, and how to hold leadership in a way that, truly creates space for others, that serves rather than holds power unconsciously or just calls the shots. And on one retreat, a very dear friend and colleague of mine had the experience of my way of leading, not leaving enough space for her experience.
Mm.
And because we both have a contemplative practice, because we both had cultivated the capacity for not only self-awareness, but kindness and compassion for ourselves, humility, a deep commitment to seeing clearly what we're bringing to the moment and unlearning internalized habits, we were able to have really rich, meaningful conversations about what was mine, what I was bringing into the space in terms of what I've learned to recognize as a kind of internalized supremacy, a certain assumption or belief that my views and preferences are right, are better, and should be the way it is. And then a kind of rigidity or control when I was expressing preferences based on that unconscious assumption. And then in her own social conditioning and role, to notice the ways that she unconsciously held back from speaking up, challenging, inviting, in spite of even my invitations to what do others think, and sincerely asking the combination of our conditioning, of my, unquestioned belief that I was right, and her own unquestioned fear, lack of
Almost like trust in her, what she was bringing.
trust, exactly, trust in her own knowing, but also a certain care for her own energy, right? Recognizing what she was perceiving as a certain rigidity in me or fixation, kind of being like, how much work is this going to be to push back on this, and is it really worth it? And it was so rich for us to talk about that and acknowledge those patterns and see how we were both falling into these dynamics that she's also identifies as white. So in this instance, there was a structural power difference in terms of my being the lead and her being a supporting teacher, and a gender power difference in terms of our gender roles. And and we both have nonviolent communication training, and we both have a deep contemplative practice, and the capacity to have that conversation and learn from each other and have it bring us closer together is so dependent on having those skills and those capacities cultivated.
And it's something that can be learned. And I think that's what's really hopeful about your book. That if anybody listening is kind of like, having that gulp when you imagine having that conversation, the way that you really highlight, almost in this kind of like scaffolding, building blocks way, that there are different skills we could learn that can get us to that place where we might not even be able to imagine it right now.
Right. Yeah. And it's one of the things that I love about doing these events together is kind of how our books support each other in that way, in terms of developing some of that inner framework and resource and resilience to move into those spaces that are so uncomfortable, and then having some of the skills and frameworks to navigate the relational space and the conversation. Yeah.
There's something else I really want to mention too. And yes, I'm definitely vibing on how our books go together. And one of the places is you talk about the importance of having a contemplative practice and also using it to really acknowledge and address some of the challenges that we're experiencing in the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
I think that's so important.
Yeah, I mean, me too. And I find like this for me, this is so much of my own exploration and practice today
Mhm.
is really discerning, where and how are the areas that my values and my practice want to flow into action and express themselves. And everywhere I go, everywhere I speak, everywhere I teach, whether I'm teaching to this book or just simply teaching meditation, um, the intensity of the suffering in our world is so deep. And I think so many of us are feeling it so acutely in our hearts and in our bodies that it's one of the most pressing and common questions I'm
Mhm.
receiving is this question of, what to do.
Yeah.
How do we take this practice and actually have an effect and not just have it be something that's making our own mind or heart or life a little bit better, but actually having an effect on the world around us. And one of the questions that I find myself asking and offering others is a question of discernment inside of what do we feel called to do?
Mhm.
Like what's mine to do? And it's very clear to me, as I think it is to many of us, that there's so many really urgent needs in our communities and in our world that we can't do everything.
Mhm.
We can't be involved in every crisis and every issue. But that also means that there is something that each of us can do. And to
Mhm.
know, like, well, what is that for me?
And connected to knowing what that one or two or, however many things are for me. Another thing that I think both you and I talk about in our books is the importance of self-compassion. Because
Mm,
as we connect with the number of things that we can't do that feel urgent and that we desperately want to have an impact on, we need to have a practice for mourning and to be
yeah,
able to hold ourselves with tenderness when
yeah,
we see that we're not showing up for some of these really big things that are so important. And if we just beat ourselves up and collapse, then we're not available to serve in the ways that we can.
yeah. Yeah, it's I love the idea of grieving and mourning also as a skill,
Hmm.
right, that we can actually increase our capacity for. And one of the things I talk a lot about in Your Heart Was Made for This um, is how these other capacities and experiences can be an expression of self-compassion, things like joy and rest and wonder, how opening to those experiences in a full way doesn't need to be an escape from the challenge of being alive and human and awake on the planet today, but can actually be an integral part uh, of increasing our capacity to be with the grief and the mourning so that we're in a better position to respond.
Mm.
Yeah.
There's something so powerful about recognizing that we can have these contemplative practices, these spiritual practices, and the choice around having them in some ways be an escape that continues in some ways to allow the harms that happen in the world, or have it be a resource that actually empowers us to go and change it. And
Yeah,
that's what I'm hearing you speak to and that you talked about in the books.
exactly. So, shall we hear a little from How to Have Anti-Racist Conversations?
Sure, sure. Thank you. And I also want to speak a little bit to our listeners. Um, so I have two books, How to Have Anti-Racist Conversations and The Anti-Racist Heart. And I loved when you shared, Oren, why you wrote your books. And I wanted to share a little bit about why I wrote my books. In part, I wrote them because I was asked. If you read the books, you'll understand why it was so hard for me to even imagine that I could write a book. But even more than that, there was something for me that felt in all of the years that I've been teaching this work and helping people learn how to show up, how to have these conversations, what are the skills and the consciousness that we need to bring to these conversations. What I discovered was that people kept getting frozen. It's like even when they learned the skills, they would start to think, "Oh, but I'm not sure if I can actually do it. There was some extra little barrier to trusting that we can step into these spaces and have these conversations. And so I wanted to write the books to help people slow down and both like really engage with the skills in a way that could help them see what was possible, but also to start to look at the internal barriers, because I think that's where we get stuck. We've internalized so many of the messages in society that unless we really take the time to understand what are some of the things I unconsciously believe, what are some of the contracts I've made with myself that are preventing me from showing up, we have all of this knowledge and we don't have the capacity to act. So I wanted to help people to cross that bridge. And so what I want to read is from the very first chapter in the book. And this is how to have explorative conversations. And I'm telling a story in the book from my early 20s when I lived in downstate New York, in New York City, and I would go up regularly to visit the person who would become my husband, who was living in upstate New York. And one of these trips, we were driving up with my brother and then my partner's friend, and my partner was white, his friend was white. And so in the car we have two black people, me and my brother, and then my partner's friend who was driving us up. So that's the context. So I was in the car traveling on Highway 17 in New York, on my way to visit my boyfriend who lived in upstate New York, and a friend was driving. We were having the kind of earnest conversations that 20-year-olds have, letting our minds wander along with our hearts. And my brother was asleep in the back seat, leaning against the window. The dark night and the blurry scenery wove a cozy cocoon where we could all relax, enjoying each other's company. My friend and I were startled out of our cozy warmth when flashing lights jolted into view. A police car had pulled up behind us, following us. Did it want us to pull over? We looked at the speedometer. We were driving just a mile above the speed limit, and we nervously pulled over to the side of the road. The lights and the sudden shift in movement jostled my sleeping brother, and I heard him groggily attempt to make sense of what was going on. Are we there already? He asked sleepily from the back seat. The officer tapped on the window before we could answer my brother. My friend rolled down the window, and instead of receiving the usual request for license and registration, he was asked to step out of the car. The officer had his hand resting on his gun. They walked together out of earshot of the car. My brother and I sat in the car, confused and anxious, unable to make sense of what was happening. And we watched the officer and my friend talk, at first with visible tension in their bodies. After a few minutes, I saw the tension slowly dissipate. The officer's hand slid off his gun, his shoulders dropped, his posture relaxed. My friend walked back to our car while the officer walked to his, and I was even more confused. When my friend got back in the car, he sat quietly for a little while. The police car drove away, and then my friend started the car and we got back on the road. My brother and I kept asking him about what had happened, but he seemed reluctant to tell us. And finally he spoke. But I could tell as he was speaking that he was wishing that what he was saying wasn't real. The officer saw us passing him on the road, and he saw me, a white man, in the driver's seat, and you next to me, a black person. And he saw your brother in the back seat. He wanted to make sure I wasn't being kidnapped. None of us knew what to say. I felt a rush of anger in my body, like a slap. But before I could really feel the anger, it became shame, hot and overwhelming. I felt as though this officer's racism meant I had done something wrong. And I could tell my brother was vibrating with anger, but he didn't know how to navigate what had happened either. We were all silent. We didn't talk any more about it. We turned the radio on and finished the drive in silence. This officer, who had seen black folks and white folks driving together, couldn't conceive of us as being part of the same beloved community. And I want to skip ahead a little bit and talk to you about what I mean by beloved community. So when I think about beloved community, I came to understand an understanding that resonated with me. Beloved community was for me family, and not the Norman Rockwell characters gathered around a beautiful table full of food, laughing and smiling at each other with no apparent tension or conflict, and not the families torn apart by the effects of generations of capitalism and white supremacy ideology, always sniping at each other and jockeying for status. When I think of family as a metaphor for beloved community, I think of people connected by love for each other whose well being is intertwined. People who see the full range of each other's human expression, regardless of how we present angry, sad, happy, scared, and pain. I think of people who know at a visceral level that regardless of how much money, resources, or social capital they have, they cannot be happy if anyone in their family is suffering. I think of people who truly understand independence, who know that their capacity to thrive is dependent on the actions of others, just as those others are dependent on them. Beloved community is a world where we see each human as family. Well, I'm willing to speak up and tell you when your actions have been too costly for me or for those around me, and invite you to consider a different action. And where I listen when you call me in, inviting me to notice how my actions impact you and those around you. Where we're willing to engage in the dance of dialogue, moving between empathy and authentic expression to create a world that works for all. Hmm.
Beautiful. I love that description of beloved community, and I always feel so moved hearing that story and many of the other stories that you tell in your book.
Mhm.
So there are a few questions I want to ask you. One of the things that's so moving for me about your book, and I read a little bit of it before it came out for the endorsement, and I'm reading it now in a more sort of careful way, is how intimately and openly you share from your life and your own experiences. And I know for myself, growing up with white skin in this country, um, there's a different level of understanding and empathy and insight, right, that arises from that depth of sharing that comes from proximity. And you invite all of us into that kind of relationship. And so what I'm wondering is, in the conversations we have in our lives, when we are seeking to make this kind of connection that leads to building the relationships towards beloved community, what guidance do you have to create the conditions to share in that way? And what are some of the considerations that any of us might want to bear in mind about even making that choice
Mhm.
about how and what to share personally?
I love this question. And you're absolutely right. I try to share very, very authentically and transparently in the book. And it's partly because I see that as part of my mission. I believe that proximity, that knowing each other, is one of the necessary conditions for us to be able to create change, for us to be able to see past all of the messages about who this group is or who that group is, and start to see each other as fully human. And at the same time, I don't know that everyone has to walk this path. There's a lot of pain and a lot of risk in being this vulnerable. And so I invite people to, and it's one of the models in one of the steps in my model is to think for yourself, what risk am I willing to bear? I'm writing this book and many of you will never meet me. And so in some ways, there's not actually that much risk, right? It's like you get to read it, you get to make whatever judgments you have about me, you get to walk away. I don't get to engage with you. But for some of us, like I'm having this conversation with my supervisor, if I, as a Black person, wanted to have this very vulnerable conversation with my white supervisor, and I talk about some of conversations like that in the book, you get to decide, is this person going to hear me? Is this person going to fire me? if I tell them authentically what's going on for me? How much do I need this job? There's so many different considerations. And it's very easy to say, once you learn these skills, you should do this. And then to beat ourselves up when we don't step into these vulnerable spaces. But I
Mm.
invite us to slow down and be choiceful, be intentional about what actually will serve all of my needs, not just the need to be known or for transparency or to attempt to make connection. And it's also something that I invite white folks to do. If I am in an organization or in a workplace and I see something happening, one of the best ways to be an ally is to be willing to take on some of that risk. So it's not just that I, as the global majority person, is being vulnerable and sharing, but what can you do as a white person to say, I want to be vulnerable. I want to speak up for something that isn't resonating with my values, and to speak to it from that place of, I'm speaking for me and my values, not on behalf of this other person. So those are some of the considerations that I like to invite people to hold.
Yeah. Thank you. It makes me think just the way you're talking about the role that these connections make and the empowered choice about when and how and where to engage in them makes me think of one particular quote from Dr. King that I'm sure you're familiar with as a scholar of his, but I pulled it up because it's so moving, and I think he's said at Cornell College, I'm convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other, and they don't communicate with each other because they are separated from each other.
Yes.
So the next question for me in this, as you know, if and when we are able to create some of that proximity, one of the things that I've seen happen again and again in dialogues across difference, whether we're talking about racial differences, gender differences, difference of religion, ideology, is that kind of sharing, storytelling can create a connection on the personal level. But often the person in the position of more power, not often, but sometimes the person in the position of more power has trouble recognizing the connection to the larger structural or systemic pieces, or it's, well, that's an experience you had, and that police officer clearly was discriminating, but it was just one bad apple, right?
Yes.
So talk to us about how you hold that gap in conversations and what skills we can bring to bear on it.
Well, one of the things that I really love sharing in the book is how to have anti-racist conversations. It's this model I have about how to talk about things that happen, how to make observations. And I always invite people to explicitly name observations that are happening on three levels. I can talk about, this very specific instance with this police officer. That's just this one thing between me and this person. But I also would want you to hear, if I were trying to tell you the story, I'd want you to hear why it impacted me so much, right? So if this happened to you, you might be like, okay, that was just one officer and walk away. But for me, this was also sitting in the place of how many times I've been stopped by police on the street. Like I remember being stopped because they said, oh, a black man robbed a store, a couple miles away. So we're stopping you. And I'm kind of going, I'm not a black man. Why are you stopping me? Right. So it's that internal, I call it an internal observation. These experiences that I have also inform how I'm going to react in any situation. But then the larger piece that you're talking about is what I call a systemic observation. And I want to teach people, how do you talk about the context in which this is happening and name it for you? So I could say, it's not even just that this one officer stopped me and, I've had police stop me in the past, but I also am sitting here thinking about all of the people who've been murdered on traffic stops, right? All of the Black folk who died because a police officer thought that their wallet was a gun. And it's that larger context that's bringing up the rage and the fear. And so helping you be able to see the things that might not even be in your awareness if they're not part of your lived experience at all of these levels. What happened, my personal experience, and then the systemic experience. How to use that awareness for someone who isn't living it.
Great. And so the having that frame and also developing the awareness internally to parse what are those different components that then allows us to be able to share and communicate in a way that's identifying this kind of multidimensional aspect of our experience. Yeah.
I also, what I love about this approach is that it really helps to, like, if a white person, like, if I come to you and say, hey, Oren, I got to talk to you about this thing that you did, right? And I was really bothered by it. It's really helpful for me to recognize that part of my upset and anger is that you did this thing, but it's also the larger context. And
Right.
it also helps you to be able to fully take me in, to take in my upset when you recognize that, yes, you did this thing and it was part of it, but a lot of this is not actually about you. It's
Right.
about the larger context.
Right.
So it creates a little bit of space where we can together look at that larger context.
Yeah.
Say, that was really horrible. You know, this
Um,
context is the thing that we both are committed to changing. It
yeah.
creates a place to come.
So this brings me to the last question I want to ask you, that I think is kind of relevant here in some way, because we're talking about one specific kind of conversation, right? Where
Mhm.
there's actually enough relationship, or there's a clear intention to not just communicate how something landed for us, what we call the impact or the effect of something, but also actually create understanding and have some hopefully movement towards transformation through the conversation. And one of the things I love about your work is you talk about these 4 different kinds of conversations, if I'm remembering right. So could you
Mhm.
just lay that out for us? Like, what are the different kinds of conversations we might be having in this context, and how it can be
Mhm.
useful to remember those and make choices about it?
Sure, I love the question. So the first conversation is the one that everyone starts with, which is something happens and you jump to a solution. Oh my gosh, we've got to fix it. And I call that a dialogue for solution. It's pretty obvious. But I often think it's a problem to start there because we haven't had enough connection. So another conversation we could have, which feels very edgy, is what I call a dialogue to be heard. It's where I say, hey, I want to tell you about what's going on for me, and I don't actually want to hear what's going on for you. I want to be heard. I want you to understand fully my experience. It's a really radical thing to say. I want to be heard, but I don't want to hear you back. I don't have the space or bandwidth to hear what's going on for you. And I trust you'll get support elsewhere. Another kind of conversation is the dialogue for shared understanding, where I do want you to hear what's going on for me, but I'm actually curious about what's going on for you. Why did you do this thing? What needs were you trying to meet? So that's the dialogue for shared understanding. And sometimes I want a dialogue for healing. I've actually had so much coming up, and I'm very aware of that larger context that we talked about that might be impacting my experience. And I'm inviting you to support me in looking at not just what happened in the moment, but this larger context to create enough of a shift that might help me to find some relief, some hope for the future. And from these other conversations, especially the dialogue for shared understanding, then we have the grounds to go to a dialogue for solution. If we start with solution without that shared understanding, chances are we're going to come up with a solution that's not going to work very well for everyone.
Yeah. I'm curious about the last one, the dialogue for healing.
Mhm.
Because that sounds like, you know, such a radical level of vulnerability. And I'm wondering, is that the kind of thing? So say you and I have an interaction, and let's say we have less relationship and trust than we actually do in our life as
Mhm.
colleagues. Um, are you imagining that you might have that dialogue for healing with me, or that you would take that to someone else in your life of a support network and say, this thing happened, and I'm
Mhm.
really looking not just to feel heard, but to have this deeper level of making sense of it?
Yeah, well, given the conditions you named that we have less relationality, I probably wouldn't start with a dialogue for healing with you. I might go for the dialogue for shared understanding. And then
Mm,
I might call my friend and say, hey, I need some support about what happened. And I might even say, could you role play Oren? And, just like I want to have an experience as if Oren is hearing me, as if he could fully understand the pain that I'm experiencing. And also, part of the dialogue for healing, which you'll learn about in the book, is being able to understand, and why did Oren do the thing that he did? Because a lot of times we make up stories about why someone took the actions they did that continue to reinforce our narrative and our pain. So it's almost helping us to let go of that story and
mm,
recognize that you're also human. In some ways, doing the best that you can.
yeah.
And that frees you from thinking everyone is bad, everyone's evil, I'll never be safe.
Yeah. I know I said that was my last question, but I want to ask one more before we shift to opening it up to questions from everyone, which is, you said that there are two books, and I know the answer to this one, but I'm going to tell everyone about what's the difference between the two books and what's the relationship between them.
Sure, sure. So the first book is How to Have Anti-Racist Conversations. And in that book, I essentially lay out um, basically the argument for why we need to have these conversations, the consciousness in which we need to bring to have these conversations, and then I describe a very step on what those conversations can look like. And as you mentioned, it has a lot of stories, a lot of examples, and some sample dialogues. But what I've also discovered is that even when people learn everything that's in the first book, they have these barriers to having the conversations. And so my friend and colleague, Sarah Payton, and I wrote the second book. And in that book, we're kind of helping you to understand what are my internal blocks to actually using this knowledge that I know that I have. And there are lots, it's a workbook. There are lots of journals, exercises, explorations to help you release whatever is preventing you from using the skills and knowledge that you have. So they go together, they complement each other.
I'm so glad.
That question.
Yeah. All right. So Rachel, are you, I think you're going to moderate, yeah?
Yep. So audience, if you have any questions this evening, please type them into the chat box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Or if you're having trouble with that, you can also put them directly into the chat, or you can DM me. Everything works. And I do have a question here that came from Rebecca saying, the two of you clearly know each other well, have worked together for a long time. How did you first start working together?
I think it was in 2007. Oren was a participant in the Nonviolent Communication Leadership Program, and I came in to do a guest lecture. And I think that was the first time we met, right?
I think so. And then you took over. We met through this organization that has since changed form and is no longer here, called Bay Area Nonviolent Communication, sort of the local nonviolent communication training organization. And then you took over the 8-month immersion program, right? I think from another colleague and friend of ours, Kathy, and taught it for a couple of years.
I think 3, yeah.
3 years. And then at some point, Roxy invited me to co-teach this 8-month program. And I think that was the beginning of our collaboration and working together actively.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. This next question came in anonymously, and the attendee wants to know, from your perspective, are any conversations hopeless? Are there any conversations that you wouldn't bother having because you have no hope that it would result in understanding?
It's a yes and no for me. So I don't necessarily think of a conversation as hopeless. I think about it as, do I have the capacity and am I willing to put the resources into having this conversation? And any conversation, if I were willing to like sit with you for like 2 weeks, we can have a conversation. And I have trust that I could make traction, but it might not serve me. You know, I always think about every conversation as, what are the needs that I'm trying to meet in this conversation? And I might choose not to put the energy and resources into that conversation.
Yeah, and I would just add something that I've taken away from your work, Roxy, in our collaboration, particularly around your work in responding to racial microaggressions, that being aware of one's purpose, which is kind of another way of looking at what needs am I trying to meet, and sometimes choosing to not have a dialogue that's about mutual understanding, right? But that's more about expressing for the sake of integrity, for the sake of safety, or as a bystander for the sake of solidarity and safety, or expressing values. And the goal is not so much dialogue or being heard. And so that's another piece that comes up for me in hearing that question, where it's like, if the conditions aren't present in me, in the field, relationally, for the kind of conversation I'd ideally want to have, I might still make the choice to speak, but it would be informed from a different perspective.
This next question comes from Liz, who starts with, thank you both for being here. I want to read Roxy's book, and I've taken several of Oren's classes. A practical question for both of you. What is the best way to respond in a nonviolent way when someone tells a racist joke? I struggle with this.
Shall I start?
Sure, you can start,
Okay.
and then I can.
Yeah. Again, so I think a lot depends on context, right? Who's present, and in terms of where my attention goes. If somebody tells a racist joke and there's someone else present for whom I think that that's going to be really painful or have a big impact, I might connect with that person first directly rather than the person who said the joke, or my response to that person might be different. So that's one thing that is in my mind. I think one of the things that I try to practice is some way of trying to separate intent and impact, and to lead with something that acknowledges or assumes best intent. So like, I'm sure you didn't mean it in this way. Or I'm guessing you weren't thinking of this when you said that. Or I know you and I trust your heart. So something that affirms the person's goodness, which can help them reduce the likelihood that they're going to get defensive and hear what's coming next, which would then be some expression of my own values, the impact it has on me, my concern, what I'm wanting, how I'm hearing it. And then probably making a request, asking for some response. How is it to hear that? Does that make sense? Yeah, that's what comes up for me.
Yeah, thank you, Oren. I noticed for me, there's a little bit of like, ooh, there would be a very specific time when I would want to affirm the person's intention, because I also want to create space. And definitely that's a wonderful thing to do if I have the capacity. But I also want to create space for us not to have to take care of the person, especially if you're the person in the power down position. It's not necessarily my job to help you feel better. And I want to
Right.
give us permission to be authentic and just say, ooh, that was hard for me to hear. Can I tell you what came up for me? And just go there, right?
Yeah.
And so being able to trust that you can still build connection, you can still build relationality, and that the person's going to be able to take care of themselves when they hear your truth is really important. What I do that's related to what I'm hearing you say, Oren, is I'm not going to assume that they were trying to be racist or trying to be evil. I'll just say, like, when you said that, this is the message I got. This is like, if it's a microaggression, this is the message that this is conveying, or the stereotype that it's repeating. That was really hard for me to hear. Are you willing not to do that again?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that would be enough for me.
And I'm so glad you kind of clarified that, because what I realized as you clarified it is that because of my social position, I often find myself in one of the power up positions, right? Like, so I check the box for so many different privileges in terms of, and I won't go down the list. So in that sense, I'm often leading with that because the other person sees me in a certain way, and I have that capacity. So if it was, say it was an anti-Semitic joke, which is one of the areas in which I don't have privilege, I might not have the capacity to lead with that, and I might go straight to the piece that you're speaking. But just recently, I was working somewhere, and there was a racial microaggression, and I was talking to the white person afterwards who had done it, and I did lead with some sense of affirming, because I felt like that would create the conditions for them to hear the other piece. And it was that choice of, from my own social position, to do that. Yeah.
I actually love this, Soren, because what you're pointing to is when I'm in the power up position, one of the ways that I can, quote, be an ally. A lot of people say, how can I be an ally? It's a big question. But one of the things you can do is to take on the burden of helping the person who did the thing that was harmful still be seen as a human being, still be met with compassion. That's an important part of my approach, that if I shame you, you're going to just basically double down. You're going to think, well, this person will never see me, so I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. So I need people to say, I'm willing to, like, check in on this person's intention, hold them with care without it having to be the burden of the person who is impacted.
Yeah.
Thank you. What a great conversation. Carolyn asks, what audiences do you most hope will read your books and why?
Hmm.
You go first, Oren.
So there are three circles. So one is people who have some kind of spiritual or contemplative practice, because I'm hoping it will help them understand it in a different way and move them towards action. I'm also hoping that people who don't necessarily have a spiritual practice, but who are actively engaged in work for social change will read the book so that they get some nourishment and some tools and some resources to sustain themselves and keep doing the work that they're doing. So those are two subsets. And then the largest is, I hope that everyone reads it, because I truly believe that there's something there for everyone in our world today, to nourish ourselves and then allow that to move us into responding with compassionate action.
I'm going to kind of second on that. Hope everyone reads it part. So yeah, at the larger frame, I hope everyone reads it, even though they're called How to Have Anti-Racist Conversations and the Anti-Racist Heart. We talk about racism as a proxy for talking about all the different systems of oppression that exist. And I've been told over and over and over again that people are finding this approach helpful in being able to talk about all of these different forms of oppression. So I hope everyone will read it, honestly. And then I also wrote it especially for people from the global majority in the United States, we'll say BIPOC folks, who are looking for ways to have these conversations, feel empowered to have these conversations, and not repeat some of the same kind of like collapsing, making ourselves small while we have the conversations that happen. And I also wrote it for white folks who so many people are saying, I want to do better. I want to show up. I want to support these kinds of conversations, and I keep not knowing how to do it. So it's really for anyone who wants to learn, how can I step into a territory that's felt very fraught and scary and do it with a little bit more confidence and hope?
So we are getting close to out of time, but I'm going to do one last audience question, which is a really interesting one. Lisa is asking if you could offer a role play example of a difficult conversation with a dysregulated or triggered individual. So that's a tough one. It's a tough ask to put you on the spot at the end of the night like this, but would you be able to do that?
I'm willing.
Okay, go for it. If you start and I'll follow along.
Okay. Why don't you? So I'm happy to be the triggered individual.
Okay.
Would you be willing to make the context, to suggest?
Sure. The context could be that well, a real example that happened to me. You walk into a store and you're sitting there talking to your white friend, and the hostess comes up and says, "Oh, are you alone?" to my friend. It's like I completely am invisible and not existing, and wants to sit, doesn't want to sit me with my friend. So if I'm that person, I'm going to say to the hostess, hello, and this is not how I would talk in real life. I'm being dysregulated and triggered. Did you not see me here?
So who am I? I'm confused.
You can be the hostess,
Okay, so I'm the hostess. I've just said to your white
my friend.
friend that,
Are you alone?
are you alone?
Can I take it
And
for one?
okay. And so which one of us has skills? The dysregulated person or the host? I'm trying to.
Yeah, let's have the hostess have skills just to be edgy.
Okay, great.
Because this happens, right? People who have skills make mistakes
Yeah.
and they're like, oh, right. Okay, so like, did you not see me here? Hello?
Oh my gosh. I feel so embarrassed.
Hmm.
You must be pretty pissed in this moment.
Yeah. It's like I was talking to my friend and it's like I'm invisible. You didn't even see me.
Yeah, yeah. And I can only imagine how many times things like that have happened to you, being a Black woman in our country, and here I am a white person, and I just did that again. I feel like I want to hide.
Well, so if I were coaching you, I would say, yes, that you were great until that last I want to hide,
Yeah,
because it's telling this kind of like, now I need to take care of you.
right.
So if I'm being dysregulated, I would say, yeah, you should hide. I'm tired of this.
Hmm. Thanks for telling me what's going on for you. And I can see how I just brought the focus right back to myself there.
Mm. Yeah, and there's a little settling in me in having that acknowledged. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope you do better.
Yeah. Could we just do this over again? Would that be all right?
Yeah, let's try.
Welcome. I'm so glad you're both here. Will you be dining together?
Yeah, thank you. Oh, what a fun impromptu role play.
So I'm so curious about
Hmm.
the I just want to hide
Hmm.
and the bringing it to oneself. Because in the moment, the aim was a certain kind of self-disclosure that I had hoped would land as empathy, a
Hmm.
certain kind of taking responsibility, but recognizing that it landed as, I feel so terrible, you need to take care of me. So just, yeah, I'm just wondering, like, let's unpack that a little bit more in that moment, because I've seen that happen where somebody shares how terrible they feel with the hope that it's somehow going to communicate, but then it goes in as like, I need something from you.
What would be helpful for me in those moments? Because absolutely, I get the urge to say I'm going to be transparent and vulnerable and hope that you get that I see how bad it
Right,
is.
right.
But if you stop there, then it's almost like you're saying, here's my need, I'm vulnerable, and
Mm,
that's it. But if you had said something like, oh, I feel pretty bad about this. I want to hide and I'm determined to do better. So can I try that again? So if you went immediately to
right.
something that was showing that you were still with me rather
Mm,
than now out here for me to take care of, I would have been able to hear it a little differently.
lovely.
Thank you both so much. That was an amazing impromptu role play, and the unpacking after also was great. Thank you both so much for the gift of your time this evening. It's been really wonderful hearing from you both and getting to learn about your work.
Thank you
Thanks for
for
having
having
us.
us.
Yeah. Take care,
And
everyone.
thank you, audience, for
Mhm.
joining us. We hope to see you at another Northshire event soon. You can visit us at northshire.com and you can find both of these authors' books there. Take care and have a good night.
Bye bye.